You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is Meditation and Attachment. This is the DYP class, or the Deepening Your Practice class. It is November 19th, 2020 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific time. And I thought I'd shift gears just for a couple of weeks. I'm going to be doing a weekend retreat with the Recovery Dharma Collective, going over the curriculum around addiction that we have. And so I thought that I would introduce it here. It's an interesting subject in our country because of the way that it has been politicized. I don't know if you know your history of addiction in this country, but at the end of the Second World War, which was 1945, so quite a long time ago, there was no real international trafficking in illegal drugs because the military controlled all of the ports in the West and also in Asia. So they really had eliminated trafficking in opioids and the different drugs that come over. And then because the Cold War began and the intelligence services engaged that, one of the things that they did in Asia was to take payment of narcotics from the different people that they were involved with. And so that they realized that as they were stockpiling these drugs, that they needed to open up the drug markets again so that they could recoup some of their cash. And the next major thing that happened was during the Vietnam War. So this is again going back to the 60s. There was a significant trade within the intelligence communities with the drug lords. Vietnam is in the area that's been called the Golden Triangle because the growing conditions for the poppy are so perfect. It also turned out that a high number of the soldiers that were in Vietnam and in those wars developed an addiction to opioids. And so when they came back from the war, the intelligence community opened up the drug markets in the US, largely supplying the substances themselves as a way of circulating the capital they had tied up in it. The government has always been involved in controlling the flow of illicit drugs in this country based on enforcement. And so you'll notice in peaks of or periods of unrest, the enforcement of substances is lax, and in times of greater cohesion, they're tightened. We have probably a much less intense illicit drug trade than we do just alcohol. Probably, I think the number I read last was 90 million people in the US use alcohol, and about 10 million of them are heavy drinkers. We don't really have the US government does not classify alcoholism. What they classify as chronic heavy drinking, and the way that they define that is somebody who consumes 58 ounces of alcohol per month if they're male, and half that amount if they're female. We also have a corporate culture that externalizes costs as a way of being profitable. So that, for instance, if you use alcohol, which is a highly addictive substance, and you become dependent on it, the companies that manufacture and supply the alcohol are not responsible for providing care for you if that happens. The same with the tobacco companies, the same with the pharmaceutical companies. That tends to fall on all of the taxpayers to pay for that treatment in some way, or in the private healthcare industry. the problem of pharmaceuticals in this country, and particularly with highly addictive pharmaceuticals like opioids or benzodiazepines or whatever the substances are, is that the change over the last probably 30 years in terms of enforcement of that. The CDC, the FDA began to allow the use of opioids for chronic pain, which became the current opioid epidemic that we have now. With the pandemic in place, one of the things that is no longer in the news is the number of ODs, but the number of ODs from opioids has skyrocketed. We're probably close to the number of people that we've lost to the pandemic to people that we've lost from ODs from opiates. There was a confluence of things that happened that made this happen in our country. If you remember in the 60s and 70s, the main source of heroin, which is the previous drug of choice, which was China White, which came from the Golden Triangle, mainly through Europe. It was controlled by the old European organized crime groups. Mainly came in through New York and then was distributed across the country. The current addiction opioid epidemic is not driven by the China White that comes through New York. It's mainly the Mexican tar heroin and the pharmaceuticals that are distributed, which is a completely different change, a complete difference to the way that it used to be. Because there was so much pressure on the illegality of these drugs, they were typically confined to lower income neighborhoods where there was already a lot of intrinsic crime. And the advent of the pharmaceutical version, or the first wave of the current opioid addiction here, was driven by pharmaceutical companies distributing it legally to, and this change into something that could be used to treat chronic pain, which actually began to happen in the 80s, principally through lobbying by the big pharmaceutical companies to change the regulations for it. Opium was the original drug, which was highly addictive, and then morphine was invented and marketed as an alternative, a non-addictive alternative to opium. Of course, it turned out to be as addictive. And then heroin was created as a non-addictive alternative to the opioid and morphine. Methadone has been created, but the current wave was Oxycontin and similar drugs, which were one molecule off from heroin, which were originally marketed as a non-addictive alternative to the other opioids. And then it was wrapped in a time-release coating and marketed for chronic pain. If you know your biology around addiction, one of the things that happens when you're using opioids is that the receptors that receive them, the endorphin receptors in the brain, are pruned back. So the longer you use it, the more tolerance you have because there are fewer receptors. And so when you can get pharmaceutical grade narcotics and you have doctors who can just up the dosages can get quite high. One of the reasons that there are so many ODs with pharmaceuticals is that when people go into rehab or for treatment and they're in there for a few months, the receptors grow back and then the dose that they were previously taking becomes lethal, so that they'll leave the rehab, not really understand that they can't tolerate the doses that they were at before, take them and die from it. The other thing that happened was that they began to market the illegal Mexican heroin to the middle class because of the advent of cell phones and the internet. They began services like We Deliver, which will deliver anything to your door if you call them, including heroin. They also began to market it in individual doses rather than in bulk, so that the way that the laws are written, it's based on how much you have, and if it's not a large dose, then you're not arrested for dealing, you're just arrested for usage. You may or may not have picked up on this statistic. During the pandemic, the alcohol sales have gone up by 240%, so that there's also a much higher incidence of people using. We don't really have a public health system in this country, which also may have become apparent from the pandemic, in the way that we've been able to respond or not respond to it. And so treatment in this country for a drug addiction or any kind of addiction is largely through insurance companies or through private pay. The insurance companies, the health insurance companies in this country have for the last 20 years or so been compiling a database of treatment failures so that they could legally pull out of paying for treatment because they can demonstrate that it doesn't work. One of the reasons that this isn't actually above board is because the insurance companies began to fund only treatments that they already knew didn't work, so that they could develop a database of treatments that don't work and then stop funding them. What they've done instead is they've replaced treatment for addiction with pharmaceuticals. One of the interesting things about particularly the opioid addiction in this country is that the easy availability of very addictive painkillers that then lead to a high tolerance, that lead to negative consequences from that, are then withdrawn and then replaced with the newer version of methadone, so a maintenance dosage of a narcotic that you can essentially take for the rest of your life. So they pull you in quite early with the one drug and then switch you to a lifelong addiction to another. With alcohol, the consequences are fairly minimal, and it's widely marketed as a lifestyle enhancer. I suppose if 1 out of 9 people becomes addicted, that isn't catastrophic in terms of a business model. This is a meditation and attachment class, and so we now get to the part where this makes sense in the context of this. The underlying cause of addiction, we think, is an attachment disturbance. That addiction is an avoidant strategy. So, or tied or highly correlated to an avoidant attachment strategy. So dismissing or a disorganized attachment strategy that is an avoidant in nature. If you have been around here and have heard me talk about attachment, when we develop emotional regulation skills, we all begin as auto-regulators. We're just within ourselves and within our capacity to understand ourselves, and we auto-regulate ourselves. And then if our caregiver comes, and they come regularly enough to us that we begin to see that they have a positive effect on us, we begin to orient towards somebody coming to take care of us. And so we become external regulators focused on the experience of the caregiver. if the caregiver comes consistently enough and in a good enough way, then we begin to enter into a collaborative relationship with the caregiver, where we develop collaborative emotional regulation skills, and we interject the skills that the caregiver is bringing to us and develop mastery in using them on our own, so that we can then go out and explore and be emotionally regulated when we do that. When you look at the underlying cause of addiction, what you're seeing is that the addiction is centered in people that don't have good enough care, that they even become external regulators. It's mainly autoregulators. You have the organized and disorganized version of that. And the organized version of um, uh, avoidant attachment strategy in adults, it's called dismissing, and you see a 30% a rate of addiction in that group. And in the disorganized group, in the fearful avoidant is the way we would call it, 70% of fearful avoidant people are addicted. You see some crossover with people who have a mixed addiction, a mixed attachment outcome. So really the addiction becomes this dependency on substances to replace people as the main regulator. And so when you begin to look at the underlying causes of this, what you're looking at are people with attachment disturbances that are related to the avoidant end of the spectrum. And so the underlying cause being this avoidant attachment strategy, one of the things that needs to happen in order for there to be a long-term outcome that's positive in terms of the addictions is to begin to address the underlying attachment disturbances that people have. If you've been around Mettagroup much and involved yourself in the meditation and attachment work that we do here, you understand that this is largely a relational repair. It's somewhat informational. There's a meditation practice component, and also this relational piece that needs to happen. And this is problematic in our culture because our culture is not set up to address it in this way. As we move into this increasing cost of healthcare, and that the large health insurance companies are moving more and more toward pharmaceutical only response to this, there's very little money for treatment for this in a relational way, which means that there's simply not a good way to address addiction in our culture except by substituting substances that are less debilitating to the people who have addiction, and having them maintain the process of addiction throughout their life. This comes at an extraordinary cost to us. One of the things to look at as to why this is the way that it is also because of the politics of addiction in this country. When it was considered simply a moral failing, which is all the way up until Nixon, then there were approaches where you were simply supposed to improve your moral condition. And so you look at programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, which are basically a Christian faith-based program that are meant to, through the grace of God, repair the moral deficiencies that allow you to engage in this depraved lifestyle. But when the 60s happened and there was a lot of pressure for social justice, yes, there's a note about the Oxford group, which was the organization that preceded AA. AA came out of that. In the 60s, when there was this movement for social justice and there was a rebirth of the left in this country, the Nixon administration joined with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There was a huge problem of fatalities and injuries related to drunk driving at the time. And they began the war on drugs, which was actually a war on the social people seeking social justice and the left in this country, an intentional strategy that they could use to imprison. One of the things about it at the time was, of course, the association of the loss of the right to vote with felony conviction. And because the view of addiction at the time was that it was a moral failing, it was very easy to attack these groups and create this perception that actually they were degenerate drug addicts and deserving of the legal intervention in a way that, had it been simply a medical problem, would not have been so easy. Can you see our country taking people who develop cancer from smoking and put them in prison because of that, or people who develop diabetes from using sugar and put them in prison for that? It doesn't make any sense at all, and it isn't an effective treatment. 70% of cancers in humans are directly related to tobacco use, and yet it's totally available at any supermarket in this country. There was big noise about the tobacco companies creating a settlement for the cost, and they settled for $280 billion during the Clinton period, which you may remember or not. But it was never collected, and they never paid it. It was basically a show trial. You have the same thing happening now with the opioid addiction problem happening. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue Pharma, which was one of the leaders in the marketing of OxyContin, agreed to pay a $280 million settlement. But when you put that up against the cost of the trillions of dollars that this has cost, it's a fig leaf, really. The Sackler family themselves moved $18 billion out of the country weeks before the settlement to a jurisdiction where there's no bank reciprocity, so they can't even get the money if they wanted to. So this is the climate that we're in terms of understanding why these conditions exist. In places where they have changed this, and if you remember, if you were aware of this in our last election cycle in Oregon, they decriminalized everything. If you look at countries where they've done this, Portugal, for instance, has decriminalized everything. They've closed all of the majority of their prisons, and the addiction rate has fallen by 58%. They have made treatment available at no cost to anyone who wants to take it, and the cost of the treatment is 1/10 of the cost of the incarceration that they were paying before. In Finland, that's also happened. They've emptied all of the prisons and closed them because if you look at these draconian laws that were created for the war on drugs, it creates this enormous problem with incarceration. In this country, 70% of the people in prison are in prison for drug-related offenses. This is an enormous amount of money, and it funds the police, it funds the court system, it funds the lawyer system. Did I say prisons? Anyway, there's these 4 groups that make an enormous amount, 70% of their budgets from keeping the drugs illegal. We then have this commercial treatment program, this for-profit treatment program, which doesn't work. So you pay for treatment that doesn't provide a solution, relapse, and then pay for treatment again. Are you getting the picture of what the conditions are of this? When you look at it through the attachment lens, what you're seeing is that these injuries happen very early in people's lives. The child who grows up with good enough care, with sensitive and nurturing caregivers, moves out of the auto-regulating stage in 5 to 8 months of early life. And if you don't have that sensitive enough care, you don't move out of it. And so the injury is very early. As you grow and develop, dismissing people tend to be pretty good explorers, but they tend to be secondary explorers. They tend to completely suppress awareness of their emotions. They tend to avoid intimate relationships where they might be able to develop some kind of emotional regulation strategies that are not dependent on external either processes or substances to help them regulate. So you're talking about individuals who tend to be in a lot of pain. When you put an EEG on children and evaluate it in correspondence to their underlying attachment mechanism, the children that are suffering the most are the avoidant children. They suppress awareness of their emotions, so they don't do anything to help them regulate the emotional experience. It's a completely unconscious thing. It does continue to inform the nature of their responses to stimulus that they receive. They just don't have conscious awareness of it. For the rest of the attachment strategies, where there is conscious awareness of what the underlying emotional conditions are, you can then take steps to affect the regulation of your emotions. And so the dismissing adults tend to want some system for emotional regulation which they can use, which doesn't allow them to be dependent on people who are the gold standard for regulation. Is that all making sense? You're getting the picture. It's kind of grim, I think, when I look at it all together like this. There are so many forces. Christian, is your hand up?
I don't want to derail too much, but I've read some stuff about psychedelics being used for treatment of addiction, I guess specifically psilocybin. And I think the studies that have been done were for smoking cessation and alcohol, and maybe perhaps there's stuff for other drugs. But I'm curious if you're aware of any of this, and if you think that like I haven't heard any of this in relation to attachment, but I'd be curious if there's research or if there's any thought about whether these drugs affect the attachment mechanism.
I don't know of any research that they affect the attachment mechanism. They do have a tendency, and there's some research, although I don't know how conclusive it is, that it resets the brain out of depression. And there's a lot of interest now in plant medicine in terms of the spiritual community, because it creates a perception of a way out of that rigidity and the solidness of the self-experience. And so you open into these no self-experiences that you get ordinarily from meditation. If you go deeply enough into it. I guess my gut reaction to it in terms of working with addiction is that it might be useful in the short term to change a depressed condition, or to open up some sense of spirit, but that as a long-term way of treating addiction, it's not going to be so useful. We talk about two models for addiction treatment. One is a harm reduction model, and one is a abstinence model. Most of the time, people do not have a single addiction. They have a pattern of using processes and also substances in a combination way that is organized to regulate a wide variety of experiences, the same way that if you developed a robust emotional regulation strategies, you'd be able to handle any situation that arose with some way of doing it. What I tend to prefer is doing the underlying attachment work and then developing emotional regulation skills, which are meditation based, because you don't lose them in stressful situations. It's one thing to go into a controlled environment, taking a controlled dosage of a psychedelic or a plant, and then have people guiding you through that process. It's another thing entirely to begin another round of self medication in a way to alleviate the difficulties with other strategies for self medication. Way back in the day in the 12-step rooms, we used to call that changing tables on the Titanic. I think that if you can begin to address the underlying attachment conditioning, that you can begin to address these patterns of use, and that if you can begin to develop supportive relationship networks around you, that the need to use becomes less and less important, and you can move out of that way of being in the world. I don't think that taking a plant would teach all of that, nor create around you the social network that you would need.
Oh, George?
Uh-huh.
The Brown, Dan Brown, I know, does hypnosis and talks about Ericksonian hypnosis, and he worked with hypnosis. And if that was to be utilized with addiction people to allow these concepts to go deeper, I think that could be beneficial. And then also, if you take, refuge recovery that Noah started and recovery Dharma, the stuff you're teaching has yet to infiltrate, or maybe the stuff you're teaching could actually be a potential for a future recovery group that's lacking right now, that they don't have these components. A group that could be started, including yourself, for the Marlat's mindful-based relapse prevention, like some kind of thing like that.
Right. I am doing this retreat through the Recovery Dharma Collective on December 12th and 13th, so that you can find it there. The program that we've developed here at Mettagroup is based on Marlat's research, and it uses the 3-pillar approach that Dan Brown developed in order to repair attachment. We have it organized around these 4 modules that are based on Marlat's work. Marlat identified 8 main conduits for relapse, and we've organized our program around 4 modules, combining some of his. The first one is craving versus urging. To understand that something happens, it triggers the mind to think of an emotional regulation strategy. And if you're set up so that addiction or some process or substance addiction is the way that you regulate that experience, then you think of using. And then if you allow the mind to engage in the thought processes of using, either through fantasy or recollection, you don't address the underlying stressor. Often what happens is that the stress level affects your cognitive ability to make a coherent decision about what to do, and you end up lapsing, which opens you to the what Marlat called the abstinence violation effect, where you have shame and regret about having lapsed, which is difficult emotions that need to be regulated, and often that creates a cycle of lapsing until you are back using at the level you were at before you attempted to stop. The second one is called stress, anger, and depression. Here's where the use of psychedelics is helpful, because it often resets the depressed mind. But when the depression is caused by thinking, you simply think yourself right back into the depressive state. Stress is something that needs to be regulated. If you regulate it by using self-generated emotion, which generates afflictive emotional states, then you generate these intense emotional states. But if you begin to exceed the bandwidth of what the brain can tolerate, then the limbic system shuts down to prevent the release of any more neurochemicals, and that's the experience of depression. The third one is a persistent negative emotion, and this really relates to the somaticized emotional experience that a lot of people who have trauma hold in the body. So when you're looking at the group of people who have the highest correlation of addiction, it's the people who have disorganized attachment, and disorganized attachment is highly correlated to trauma. And so you have a lot of intense experiences of afflictive emotion which have been somaticized, and the constant experience of those afflictive emotions is one of the conduits toward relapse. You use to medicate the emotional experiences of that. And the last one, which is really a combination of three of the Marlat indicators, is difficult interpersonal relationships. The main cause of relapse in people is social isolation. It's painful in itself. If you can't put around yourself functioning relationships, and your tendency is to remove yourself from relationships when they become too overstimulating, then the social isolation that comes from that strategy for regulating is the thing that causes most people to relapse. In order not to have that happen to you, you have to be able to be engaged in a social group. One of the reasons that the 12-step world works so well is because it's a social group that you can come to that isn't dependent on individual relationships. The meeting is there, and there's many protocols set in place to greet people and to communicate with them warmly so that they can feel some connection to a group, and the emotional regulation that comes from that is then available to them, and they don't have to be so isolated. Is that all making sense? Our early conditioning affects the way that we create the view of the world, and then we go about operating in the world as if that's the way that the world is. And depending on how we do that, we end up in this place where the world and being alive is so painful that we then need to take substances that engage in behaviors that relieve that painfulness. Most of the substances that are strong enough to relieve that painfulness also have a tolerance built into them. So if you remember drinking, if you don't drink that much, you have a glass of wine or a cocktail or a beer, and you have an effect from it. But if you drink enough that you develop a tolerance to it, one is no longer enough to have an effect. So then you have to take two. And in taking two, you still have that effect, but if you develop a tolerance to it, if you use it often enough, and then you have to take three to have the same relieving effect. But that high a dose may cause cognitive impairment or judgment issues, and that you then may begin to have external consequences to the using, which is typically the cycle that happens. But then if you use enough at that level, you have to use even more, and the impairment becomes greater and the consequences become greater. And then the social structures that that you've been able to create around you begin to come apart. In order to, you don't really have a choice about whether you emotionally regulate or not. you have to emotionally regulate. The body mind can't tolerate the dysregulation, but you do have agency in how you regulate. If you grow up in a family system where using substances or process addictions is the way that you learn to regulate, then that's what you're going to learn to do. And what you're going to need to do now is learn alternatives to that. And so that's really what this approach is, to retrain through the use of ideal parent figure protocol, the capacity to be in relationship, and then through the meditation strategies to learn meditation-based emotional regulation skills, so that you can train yourself out of in the 12-step world, we used to call it stinking thinking that leads you to drinking. Because this class is a meditation class, I'm going to talk about this process of tracking the thinking process. So it's a development of metacognition. And so we're going to spend tonight's practice mainly focused on tracking thought. One of the tricky things about tracking thought is that the content of thoughts can be quite sticky and pull you in. So it's very common to get caught up into thinking and then come back and then reset, and get caught up into thinking and come back and reset. Is that all making sense? I think that the instructions are simple enough that if I just give them, you'll be able to track it. So why don't you go ahead and settle into your meditation posture. So any comments or questions about what we did?
I had a question, George, regarding the clear talk, the differentiation between clear talk and the other kinds of talk, and what would be some examples of that, like verbal examples?
Well, a one-off thought versus a repeating thought. Is that what you mean?
Or clear talk versus maybe gibberish, but that's not what you're referring to then. Like some kind of irrational thought, or kind of versus something that's logical or rational.
No, clear talk are the words whose meaning you can understand. So even if it were a series of non sequiturs, as long as you can understand the words, that would be clear talk.
Mm-hmm.
There is a vibratory activity that's often in auditory thinking space, which is just a vibratory sound without any words being differentiated. And if you get highly concentrated and focus on that vibratory energy, what you'll notice is that the cognition of what the clear talk will be precedes the clear talk arising out of that. But most of the time we're not paying attention, so the clear talk just enters the mind, and we don't notice that process of the vibratory energy, then the cognition, and then the clear talk arising. So if you notice that the mind is engaged in just a running commentary, then you begin to evaluate the quality of the commentary as being one-off thoughts that are typically related to the present moment, and repeating thoughts that are typically related to the past or the future. So memory or planning, worrying, that sort of thing. Is that making sense?
Yeah, like sometimes when I'm meditating, I have thoughts about what I did with my bicycle, or having the brakes fixed, or what am I going to have for dinner after, Mettagroup meditation.
Right.
Or sometimes I'll have
Where's the bell?
I'll have a sexual fantasy,
Right.
that I oh no, that's not proper, Marie. No sexual fantasies here.
Yes, the Buddha is listening. The sexual fantasy is often a repeating thought because it's not related to the present moment typically. So that would be something that I would investigate as a repeating thought.
Mm-hmm.
One-off thoughts are like, what was that noise? Ouch. this hurts, or whatever it is.
In a way, it's like hear out or feel in, maybe. It's
Right.
related to that.
Well, the internal process of self and thinking typically is internal visual experience, internal auditory experience, and emotion in the body. So that's what we're mainly tracking. If you're distracted by something that's happening outside of the body, often there's a thought in relationship to that, but then those would be activations of external sight, external sound, or the felt sense of the body.
So in some sense, thoughts come before feelings, or feelings can come before thoughts. Could it be both ways?
It's omnidirectional. Any sensing activity can activate any other sensing activity. I like to teach it in a linear way so that you can learn to identify it and explore it, but then understand that that's artificial and it's meant as an organized learning strategy. But once you learn it well enough, then you can begin to notice that it's just popcorning all over the place. Good enough?
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
All right. Someone else? Christian.
I'll try and make this concise. I was sort of off in so many directions. But I was trying to do like rest, but like I would have like a moment of rest, but mostly I would just have like looping music, just looping all over the place. And so
that
I kind of like, I don't know if that's a repeating thing because it doesn't have any lyrics or really content, but then I sort of got tired of it and just went to the body, and I just realized how like uncomfortable I was. And it wasn't until I kind of sat with that for a while that I started to realize I had some thoughts about how uncomfortable it was. So I kind of went from the other direction, and then I seemed to have gone into like a pool, and I was just like raging, but I stayed with it. So it was something, but it wasn't at all, the practice. So I guess my question is about what to do with music, at least.
Music is a repeating thought. So you just create a label for it and then check visual thinking to see if there's something that's more discernible there, and then drop down into the body and see what emotion the music is generating. But then you also discovered another piece, which is that there's often an underlying feeling state that causes the mind to generate the thought. So that the painfulness in the body was likely the thing that was causing the mind to generate the music as a way of self-soothing.
Yeah, I've noticed that music is definitely a coping strategy for me in all kinds of like stressed out situations.
So then what you've identified is the activity of self-generated emotion as a regulation strategy. That's what I was trying to get you to see. So you saw it clearly. Mm-hmm. Understand that repeating or a tune, we like to call those tunes. That's usually the label I use for them.
That was the label I was doing, because I think last time I did this meditation with you, I had the same problem.
So tunes, it's one of the reasons I don't like to go to the gas station, because they're always piping music in. It's always catchy pop, and it catches my mind, and then I have to listen to it for hours after I leave. Tunes are generally thought of as a skillful means of emotional regulation. So you don't necessarily need to do anything about that. It's only when the mind is engaged in thoughts that generate afflictive states that you want to change that. So good, you have the insight.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else? Something else. All right.
George?
Yeah.
Well, since the days of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's been a lot of things since then, like the secular recoveries, like LifeRing, secular organization for sobriety, and then Smart Recovery is very popular now, but they rely on CBT and REBT, so they're going for a real cerebral kind of try to engage the prefrontal cortex
Right.
and build that kind of muscle. But the communication and people getting together is one of the main ingredients, I guess, like you said, of AA. But now with LifeRing or Smart, you do have people getting together and communicating and developing, like Recovery Dharma, without the overlay, the religious or philosophical overlay of AA,
Right.
which I had a therapist says that it's not very helpful. The powerlessness, the reliance on a higher power, maybe the shaming that goes on, or some narcissistic behavior there. So
Well, any of the abstinence only programs are going to create a social hierarchy that's really artificial, and also create these boomerang effects where lapses end up in relapses. The God component also is, it's not so much the belief or disbelief in God, but it's that God's grace is the curative peace, and so that you don't have to do anything in order for that to happen. The main value, I think, of that aspect is the community, that you can be a member of a community that's there and regulating you, and that you can develop the skills of relationship there. That's the piece. I am familiar with the other programs too. I do tend to think of them as providing mainly the community aspect.
and they've gotten very popular, and since COVID, there's so many Zoom meetings that there's a lot more availability to people.
Right.
Which is a benefit of the COVID, the side effect, yeah.
Right. It also has the limit that you're not actually in the physical energy of people, which is part of the thing that's necessary for emotional regulation. But yeah, I hear you. Good. Next week, Thursday, is Thanksgiving, so there'll be no class. December 3rd, we're starting a meditation and attachment level 2 class, which will go for 6 months. There's 12 classes. You can sign up with mentoring sessions or without mentoring sessions. And we do have some scholarship funds available for that. If you take a look at the website, mettagroup.org, it's on there. If you want scholarship help, just call the office and we can set that up for you. December 7th, I'm going to read again from my book, The Lower Manhattan Dormitory Effect, and hopefully there won't be some big political hoo-ha that happens at the same time. I'm going to focus on the sections of the book that are related to the AIDS crisis of the late 1970s and early 80s in New York. The book is The Lower Manhattan Dormitory Effect, a memoir of 1979 New York in photographs and lyric prose poetry. So it does focus on that period. The 12th and 13th is a weekend retreat that I'm doing in conjunction with Recovery Dharma Collective, which is going to take whoever attends through the 4 modules of the Mettagroup Meditation and Attachment for Addiction curriculum. So you can sign up for that if you want to, either through Recovery Dharma or on our website. On December 28th, I'm starting a 6-day virtual retreat, which runs through January 2nd. So that week, there'll also be no class. And then the week after that, I'm going to take a vacation. I don't know that I'm going to go anywhere, but I'm not going to work, which is a sorely needed rest for me. So there'll be no class during that as well. So we'll send out an email letting everybody know. But in the coming weeks, there There's going to be 3 Thursdays where there's no class. I do offer the classes on a dana basis. Dana is the Pali word for generosity. So I offer the teachings freely, and then I hope that you'll support me through donations. Any amount is appreciated. It helps pay my overhead and also support the work that Mettagroup is doing. There's links to make donation on the website or in the email that you may have received about the class. If you don't have resources, then there's no need to make a donation. The community is very happy to support the practice period for you. Thank you for coming, and we will see you next time. Bye now.